Welcome to DEIJ Hot Takes. My name is Daryl Sinclair, and this is the podcast where we discover the bold and transformative ideas shaping diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice work today. In this episode, we are joined by Nunana Nyomi, who is the secondary school principal at the International School of Geneva Nations campus, and a seasoned DEIJ consultant delivering a module on DEIJ within the ECIS Middle Leader Certificate course. Nunana, thank you so much for joining us today. Hey there.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
Well, could you please share with us the DEIJ hot take that guides your work?
Sure. My hot take for today is ensuring that all voices are valued does not mean that we should strive for unanimous agreement.
Okay. So the idea of aiming for a unanimous agreement, which can sometimes be the excuse for inaction. So very excited to hear about this. Could you take us through what this means in the context of DEIJ work, why you feel this is a hot take, and how you address this or realize this in the work that you do?
Sure. I would say it's actually a relatively simple concept. For me, it's come through the work that I've been doing often puts me in positions where we talk a lot around inclusion. Mm-hmm. And I would say an often used technique, maybe it's a technique that's used unintentionally by people. It's not always explicit, their intention, but it often ends up delaying progress. Yeah. Is to say, well, you're all about inclusion. Well, then, what about this perspective? Or what about that perspective? And I disagree. So you're not being inclusive of my voice if my voice isn't included. So it automatically forces us to better define what do we mean by inclusion. And that's often where I start with that hot take, is to say, actually, we're not here trying to say that it's going to be unanimous agreement.
Yeah.
That's kind of an impossible standard that we can aim for. But what we can do is we can guarantee that all voices are going to be valued, that all voices are going to be heard. So it's more about how do you create systems, how do you create procedures, ways of working that allow for voices to feel comfortable, confident, to share, here's what my perspective is, here's what my perspective is. Even if the conflicting perspectives, at least we've been able to invite that debate and that perspective. So, creating multiple access points. It's a lot like, we talk about universal design for learning. Yep. As a concept, often is underpinned by these multiple access points for our students. That's the same thing as we're working with adults. How do we make sure that we are allowing people the psychological safety and the space to bring their perspective forward, but then also helping people understand bringing your perspective forward doesn't necessarily mean we're going to go with your perspective. Yeah. That we have lots to learn from everyone. We're going to try to create environments where those perspectives get brought in. And then ultimately, a decision has to be made about which direction to go forward. And I'm always keen on whatever decision is taken, whatever direction an institution goes in or a group of people decides to move in, don't lose those voices that were maybe dissenting or maybe had a different perspective that wasn't fully brought in to the decision. But keep those records. Yeah. Because more often than not, what I found is that actually those records come back to become important in another context, in another place. So it's really important to keep the history of how you got there, keep the voices involved so that everyone does know that it contributed still to our advancing our culture in a certain way. So yeah. That's probably in essence what I would say is my explanation for kind of coming to this conclusion.
And some really great points you've made there. I like what you just said with regards to knowing how you reached a decision, which can be very useful in the future, and also provide learning points for when similar voices or opinions and perspectives perhaps become more popular or more common, and perhaps are given a different weight. And also what you said at the beginning there, where you do aim for unanimous decision, it can also empower people, unfortunately, to purposefully prevent forward movement by claiming that they're not being listened to and thus preventing a decision from being made. Now, one of the questions I have with this approach is when a decision is being made, when it reaches the decision-making point and it's not unanimous, what strategies and approaches could be used to determine what is an acceptable level of dissatisfaction from a group or the community, or an acceptable level of potentially what could be harm caused to an individual or to a community? How do you approach that part of the decision making?
Sure. I think that last part of your question is definitely one to start with.
Mhm.
You have to look at the harm aspect. Who is being harmed? Who is at the most risk in a certain circumstance? Ultimately, I think a big part of a school's role is the idea of keeping students safe.
Yes.
And so, starting from that perspective and saying, okay, all right, who's at risk of being harmed here? And have their voices been incorporated into this process? And if by taking the decision, let's say the majority point of view,
Mm.
who is at risk of being harmed? And doing one's best to make sure that as much as possible that harm is mitigated or accounted for, reduced. That's going to be an important thing. And so we need to ask ourselves those questions constantly of
Mm.
have we done enough to ensure that the harm is eliminated? Then once it's kind of like the hierarchy of needs. It's almost a way in which we could look at this. Have the basic needs of everyone been met?
The
Okay,
same.
if we've been able to do that, then we can start moving further up into the echelons to start to look at ultimately self-actualization. How can we make sure that we're all thriving, or at least as many people can be thriving within this context with this decision process? And so the more that we start at the basic and then move on, then I think we end up putting ourselves in a better place to reduce the effects that might come from taking a decision that ultimately not everyone is going to agree with.
I really thank you for the clarity in that. I think that's going to be very useful for our listeners in how to approach those decisions. I think we've got time for a second question. So I'm going to ask, because this was very interesting to me. In my work in school leadership and even consultancy, I found that one of the struggling points is that sometimes people don't know how to express what they want or need. So even where decisions are made which specifically listen to the voices and try to make a reality of what is being requested, there can still be dissatisfaction once it's made a reality. Are there any strategies or approaches you've used or success you've had in the past where you try to ensure that the decisions will have the best outcome, whatever that may mean in the context, even if from the outset you might be going against what someone has said? How do you approach that?
Sure. I think for me, the journey is the most important thing. First of all, I think we always focus at the end result and say, this is where we need to go with this decision. But I tend to be quite obsessed with the actual journey, because what I've found to be true in my interactions is more often than not, people want to know that they were heard.
Mm-hmm.
They want to know that they were valued, that they were considered truly part of the community. And so I come back to, what was your process? That's the question. And how was your process as inclusive as possible? So for me, my techniques tend to start with, and this is quite similar for a lot of diversity and inclusion approaches, start with yourself, trying to ensure that people have done some self-reflective work, trying to figure out what is your positionality, what are the things in which you find yourself marginalized, the areas in which you might find yourself as having privilege, and how might that be affecting what you're bringing to the table, what the decisions that you might, the ideas you might want to promote. So if you've first done that self-reflective work, then it puts you in a space where you're hopefully in a more empathetic space and you're really trying to think more about the group versus maybe the one need that you might have individually. Then second step for me is you want to create that shared understanding. So after you've had that space for self-reflective work, how do you then work with a group to start building around some level of a shared agreement? And that, obviously there are tons of community agreement protocols that are out there. My favorite comes from the National Equity Project. And it's really a negotiation. It's where people are coming down and they're sharing a bit about what they would like to see, and other people share. And there's a time of negotiation. You kind of see what rises to the top.
Yeah.
And that might start to highlight certain things, certain themes to look at. But then the key is not to leave it at that level, but also to look at cycles of continuous improvement. I often see that equity work draws a lot of parallels with systems and design thinking, and those types of approaches. So the first thing in design thinking is all about empathy, the first step, and empathizing with problems, and then often going then into ideation and prototyping. And so how do you then create those models where we understand this is an iterative process, that okay, today this is where we are with whatever decision, but that's not the end. It's part of the journey, and we're going to revisit this. And so that's why I said earlier, capturing those points where maybe people didn't agree necessarily. You still have those. So then if things happen, you can come back to the told you so group and say, actually, you did have a point here. Let's revisit that. Or how does this new set of circumstances affect what we might want to do for our community and our culture here? Creating those moments of introspection, reiteration, and then reattacking problems. So I see it very much as a continuum, as a continuous journey, as opposed to saying just that we're going to focus on the fact that people might not agree with us, at the very end of it. But I think if people understand that through it, we've encouraged them to self-reflect, we've encouraged them to bring their voices forward, and that throughout the process, we still want to consult and share progress and gain input as we continue, then there's that loop, that continuous loop that's going on that lets people know I'm valued here,
Mhm.
I matter here. And generally, from what I see, that helps
Oh,
coach.
no, that sounds brilliant. And that's a system which continues to affirm itself. So, with DEI work, always wanting it to be able to establish and reestablish itself rather than being a single moment which can potentially be lost or forgotten. Um, so, what would you say for our listeners would be a key takeaway from what you've just shared with us? Something that perhaps they can take with them or apply to their thinking or their work, whether it's a resource, a question, or whatever. What's your key takeaway for us?
Sure. I think if it's okay, I'm probably going to break the trend and have two takeaways. Um, first of all, my first takeaway is inspired by Lilo and Stitch. It's something that I've been preaching at our students all year. The movie's coming on a renaissance. There's going to be a new live action version, and I encourage people to go out and watch it. But one of the key phrases from this movie is this idea of, Ohana meaning family. But
Mhm.
more importantly, that family means that nobody gets left behind or forgotten. And so, whether it's with my staff, whether it's with students, we've just been talking a lot around, are we making sure that everyone's with us? Has anyone been left behind or forgotten? Just simply asking that phrase, that question, as we do our systems work, I think goes a long way. And then the other takeaway that I'd like to add is from Michelle Mijung Kim's book, The Wake Up. And she provides us with a variety of different strategies and ways to look at inclusion. And I love how she describes the cases that are made. There's always the kind of the business case for inclusion, like it's good for profit, but it ends up, if it's not good for profit, then it all falls apart. If you try to make the case it's the right thing to do, but that again only works only so far, because at some point it might be the right thing to do, but it puts you in an uncomfortable position, so you don't want to do it.
Mhm.
But the third thing that I think is more lasting is when people understand that their liberation is bound up with yours, that your liberation is bound up with mine. When we come with things with that approach, to say that I truly cannot enjoy freedom if those around me are still suffering, then we're missing out on something. And that framing has really helped me as I go into my work. So one of my key takeaways as I, talk around this work of inclusion and developing systems and loops of communication and everything else is reminding myself constantly and our communities constantly that our liberation is bound up with each other. So we need to continue to look out for those who might be voiceless within it.
Brilliant. No, thank you so much for sharing that. And I didn't know that movie was coming out also. So that's something to look forward to. But the key takeaways there with regards to no one being left behind is such a thoughtful way of approaching it, and really speaks to how making a decision can ensure that everyone is safe, and then you move upwards from there. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Nunana. For our listeners, I will place links in the description where they can connect with you, explore your ideas and some of your work, and also all of the great things that you've mentioned there. Thank you for listening or watching, and I will see you on our next episode of DEIJ Hot Takes. Thank you, Nunana. Bye.
Thank you very much.